Hello, all. It is my pleasure today to read to you the sermon that was set aside for Rita King's funeral service, which was a few days ago. Rita always enjoyed what we call these rocking chair sermons, and so when we talked about her service, she asked if I would use one of them. So this is for Rita. So what you have to do is, if you're not familiar with these, you have to picture a couple living in northern British Columbia. They're some years beyond retirement. They live out in the country along the river, and raise cattle. Case the husband does some trucking. But the idea is that every once in a while they would write us a letter, because Krista and I had our first church out there quite a number of years ago. And so these letters are sort of a way that they keep in touch with us. So, without further ado, the letter is dated July the 16th. Dear Everett and Krista and kids, greetings to all of you once again from your long-lost friends far and away up in Honora, British Columbia. We are pleased to report back to you that both Case and I are doing well, aside from the occasional ache and pain that keeps us grounded and humble. It is our prayer that all of you are similarly blessed, minus the groaning and grumbling. We have been glad to see the early spring roll on into a beautiful summer, and as short as it is up here, we are doing our very best to soak it in as much as we can. We hope you are enjoying the sun's warmth as much as we are. We've been thinking a lot lately about taking in God's blessings as long as we're able. I don't know if you heard the news about Bill Lundgren. He will be sorely missed for sure. Long back, a lifetime ago, he was the first person to welcome Case when he started at the mill. The two of them would practice their English together while working on the sorting line. Imagine the two of them, a Dutchman and a Swede, each of them fresh off the boat, trying to piece together their own histories using this strange new tongue. Less and less they relied on their grammar school German as iron sharpened iron in the new country. And of course, there were all the adventures they concocted over the years, from practical jokes out in the bush to that eco-terrorism adventure a few years ago when Joe Marshall's streamside logging was destroying their favorite steelhead hole. But I think for Case, the most memorable will be their last adventure together, a kind of final hurrah. Did you know that Bill had a stroke about a month and a half before he passed? He did. A very bad stroke. Case and I saw him in the hospital the morning after he was admitted. It was a shocking sight. He was already out of intensive care and down in one of the regular rooms. He was slumped in the bed, his hair a mess, with the right side of his face drooping down. From that side of his mouth, he was drooling, and tears were rolling down his cheek on his right eye, or from his right eye. The nurses had already warned us that he was unable to speak, though he had some ability to write yet, just not with his right hand, and he was right-handed. It was a hard moment. You folks are still too young to know what it's like to have your friends be hit by the kinds of illnesses and attacks we had always thought happened only to old people. It is a hard thing to get old, let me assure you. But still, I suppose, it is better than the alternative. Bill couldn't speak, though he struggled mightily to say something. Case sat at his side and told him it was okay. You don't have to talk, Bill, he said. You just rest up. But Bill kept trying until I put a pen in his left hand, and he scratched out on the edge of some hospital form in front of him just one word: thanks. And he started to weep, his eyes closed, his chest silently lifting and falling. Case put his hand on Bill's hand and sat by him in silence. That was our first visit. On the drive home, Case was even less talkative than usual. It wasn't until we parked in the laneway and Case shut off the truck that he turned to me and said, "If that ever happens to me, you have my permission to pull the plug." Well, that's a fine thing to say, I responded. Sounds like you're not very optimistic about recovery. Bill could get a lot of his old strength back and get some skills again as he goes through physiotherapy. And besides, I pointed out, he wasn't actually plugged into anything. There's no plug to pull. He's just sitting in bed. Case opened his mouth to respond, but I held up my hand. Don't say it, I cut in. I'm pretty sure I don't want to hear it. I got out and went into the house. And Case stayed in the truck for a long time. Case and Carl Schneider took turns every other day, sitting for part of the afternoon with Bill. It wasn't long before he was transferred from the hospital over to the Sayoo Valley Regional Senior Care Facility in Dempsey. At least I think that's the official name. We'd always called it the fossil beds, but it seems that name is not as funny now as it used to be. Once Bill was settled into his room, it became a lot more difficult for Case to visit. The therapy didn't seem to be doing any good, and the thought of Bill being confined to that bed in that room for the rest of his days was pretty hard for Case to bear. He's never been much for carrying on a conversation on his own, but Bill wasn't able to say much, really just grunting in agreement. So sometimes Case would read the paper out loud or just sit in silence. His visits seemed to be getting shorter, and I was going to say something to him about it when Pastor Morton beat me to it. It wasn't really that he singled Case out or anything like that. It was what he said in his message. He'd been preaching his way through the Sermon on the Mount on and off, and this particular Sunday, he hit upon this one part from Matthew 7. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks, the door will be opened. Which of you, if his son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. Do unto others, the golden rule. That's what got Case's attention. Pastor Morton talked about the loneliness of life apart from others and the loving example God showed in giving his son. But all Case needed was the reminder of the call to treat others as we would wish to be treated. And he thought immediately of Bill lying in his lonely bed in exile from life all around him. How would Case want to be treated? What would we have hoped for? What would he have hoped for from Bill if the roles were reversed? Well, Case didn't take long to figure it out. The next day, he went to see Bill right after breakfast. It was a beautiful late spring day, and Case rolled out the wheelchair, and he helped Bill to climb aboard. Not being up on such details, Case didn't bother to check out at the nurse's station. And Bill didn't object, so off they went. They spent a couple of hours walking and rolling through the park and up and down past the shops on Main Street. By the time they got back, though, there was a piper to pay. It seems Bill was scheduled for physiotherapy that morning. When the therapist went to Bill's room and saw the bed was empty, the staff made a call to his daughter, Nellie, on her cell phone. They assumed that he was out with her since she is his only family in town. Only she wasn't in town. She was over in Edmonton visiting with her daughter in university. Now, Nellie's always been a worrywart, and she took over that role in her father's life when Bill's wife, Margaret, passed away already 15 years ago. So when she heard that her father had disappeared, she blew a gasket. She accused the nursing staff of being either incompetent or uncaring and threatened a lawsuit. That set off a building-wide code green, what they call a runner on the loose. I thought that was somewhat ironic, since if Bill could actually run, he wouldn't be at the senior care center in the first place. So while Bill was returned safe and sound, there were repercussions. Aside from the need for signing out and back in, each of the residents was given a computerized monitor to wear, like a wristwatch. My friend Arlene, who works at the center, she described it to me. The wrist monitors would keep track of each resident's body temperature and heart rate, and if they ventured off their wing, an alarm would sound. So in one fell swoop, they satisfied Nellie's complaints and put an end to Case's travels with Bill. He was soon back to reading the paper out loud. Nellie did not allow Case on the approved for outings list, and Case seemed to have lost his ambition for giving Bill a taste of life. One night I asked him, "Whatever happened to do unto others as you would have them do unto you?" "Well, that's just it," Case replied. "How would I want it done unto me? If I were in Bill's shoes, I know I wouldn't want him to go into all kinds of fuss and trouble just for my sake. I'd be glad of his visits, but I wouldn't want to become a burden." I eyed him skeptically and was just about to open my mouth when he held up his hand. "Save it, because I'm sure I don't want to hear it. Maybe you just don't understand men's friendships." With that, he went out to the barn to check on the cattle. And so it stayed, until we read from the Gospel of John in the Dinner Time Devotions booklet. It was more from the words of Jesus, this time as he sat at the Last Supper with his disciples in chapter 15. "My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." Case went quiet after the devotions, and as I was clearing the dishes, I took the opportunity to point out that sometimes doing unto others is not enough. Loving a friend as Jesus loves means making some sacrifices. Case looked up at me, and I expected a comeback, but he didn't say anything. He took up the leftover potatoes and applesauce and carried them to the kitchen, an act I found both touching and unnerving. He never helps with clearing the dishes. So I thought perhaps the call to loving sacrifice had gotten through. I thought Case would swallow his pride and apologize to Nellie and ask her to put him on the outings list for Bill. But I was wrong. Boy, was I wrong. The next night, Carl Schneider was over. He and Case were sitting at the table talking in low voices, plotting Bill's escape. Since I knew there was nothing I could do to talk them out of it, I decided to leave them to their plans and go watch Wheel of Fortune with the dog. I figured the less I know, the better. The next day, Case sat with Bill as usual in the morning. He left at his usual time, and then Carl came in after the nurse fed Bill his lunch. He came in with a duffel bag, which might have looked a little curious. Once he got to Bill's room, he opened the duffel bag and took out a large, powerful magnet. He attached it to a certain spot on the top of the metal frame on the emergency exit near Bill's room. It was a trick his son, Charlie, had given him. Charlie works in construction and had been a part of the last renovations at the senior care center. They learned you could bypass the alarm system with a magnet placed just right on that door frame so that the alarm sensors couldn't tell if the door was opened. It's how they had a shortcut to their trucks to retrieve needed tools and thermoses. So with the alarm out of commission, Carl opened the back door and let Case back in. Case said when they got to his room, Bill looked both apprehensive and excited. After they got Bill transferred to his wheelchair, Case went out to the hallway and got old Sid McAuliffe, who'd been wheeled out of his own room for his afternoon nap in the hallway. They wheeled the two chairs side by side so that Bill's right arm was right next to Sid's left arm. Carl undid the Velcro band on Bill's little monitor, and they quickly transferred it over to Sid's arm. The heart monitor didn't miss a beat. Case returned Sid to the hallway as Carl outfitted Bill with sunglasses, a hat, and a blanket out of his duffel bag. Now, why they felt the need for a disguise, I will never know. But after checking the hallway one more time, they were soon out the back door, into Carl's Suburban, and off into freedom. Of course, they made a beeline straight to the Tim Hortons. By all accounts, it was a fine reunion. Bill soon emerged from under his disguise and was back in his regular place. Kay said Bill's lopsided smile said it all. They spent the better part of the afternoon drinking coffee and wiping drool, laughing and gossiping like the grumpy old codgers they have become. Bill was, I'm sure, in his glory. Only it was not a long-lived glory, for there soon arose trouble at the senior care center. That afternoon, about an hour after the boys had left, an alarm went off at the central nurses' station. There were two code reds at the very same moment, 2 stopped pulses. According to the computer monitoring center, one of them was Sid McAuliffe, and the other was Bill Lundgren. The panic over the alarm increased when Bill could not be found, and it increased even further when they found Bill's monitor on Sid's arm. Soon Nellie was called, and then the police were called, and that's when my friend Arlene called me. She didn't know what was up exactly, but knowing Case and the history of Bill's last disappearance, let's just say she had a hunch. Right away, I called Case, and I told him the jig was up. Time to get Bill back to his room. So they said their goodbyes and wheeled Bill over to Carl's Suburban. Only they didn't head back. Once they left the parking lot and turned to Main Street, Carl went right on past the senior care center and turned out onto the highway and drove out of town. They went northeast, up Broken Circle Road. They continued on, up the switchbacks, past the cross-country skiing trails, up to the lower ridgeline of Mount Fraser. Carl drove on to an old logging road on the south slope, and they bounced their way to a clear cut. It was one that had been logged a couple of years ago, but not for the first time. It had been cut once long before, a long time ago, by a ragtag crew of immigrants, young and strong, in the prime of their lives. It was one of the first stands Bill and Case had worked together in the bush. Carl drove to the far side of the landing, toward the edge of the ridge, and he parked. Together, he and Case got Bill into his wheelchair and half carried, half lugged him through the rough meadow of old stumps and fresh, thin saplings, planted the previous summer by another crew, mostly college students, young and strong. They set the wheelchair down at a spot nearby where they could overlook the entire valley below them. Case stayed with Bill as Carl went back to his vehicle and returned with 2 lawn chairs and a cooler. Case and Carl set each of their chairs up, one to the left and one to the right of Bill. And once they were seated, Carl reached over to the cooler and he pulled out 3 ice-cold bottles of Labatt's Blue. He twisted off the cap of Bill's bottle, put it in Bill's good hand, and dropped a straw into it so Bill could drink his own beer with dignity. Carl also put a straw in his own bottle, and he handed one to Case as well. There on the mountain, Case and Carl clinked their bottles with Bill's in a silent toast to a lifetime of friendship and an expression of love as only those 3 could appreciate. Together they sipped their beers as they watched the sunset shade of Mount Fraser work its way east, back across the valley below them, the oranges and purples growing and glowing in the distance. The shadow passed over the clear cut where the boys themselves had once logged, and over the town and across the valley where all of us have toiled and laughed and cried and lived. Bill wept and drooled, and Case used his handkerchief to keep him dry. In time, of course, they had to return. But it was really the cooling air that brought them back more than any commands of the clock. Carl could see that Bill was starting to shiver, and it was time to go. He and Carl gathered their belongings, and they gathered their friend and returned him to town. So imagine their surprise when they saw the senior care center surrounded with all 3 of Dempsey's police cars, every one of them, their red and blue lights flashing. They tried sneaking in the back emergency door, but in Bill's room they soon met with 2 police officers and a very relieved Nellie, who was soon replaced with a very irate Nellie. In near hysterical shouts, she talked about stalking and kidnapping charges. She was just getting rolling, Arlene said, when she was stopped by Bill. He himself started waving his one good arm and making a loud, kind of groaning sound, almost like a roar. He signaled for a pen and paper, and he wrote in his trembling hand, "No trouble," Nellie, the tears streaming down her face, knelt by his side and said that, in fact, it had been big trouble looking for him, trying to figure out what had happened, and that a lot of people had been looking for him. He shook his head and took up the pen again, adding 2 words so that his page read, "No trouble for them." Nellie could see her father was both angry and determined, and decided that he'd had enough excitement for the day. She slumped into a chair, exhausted. At that point, the constable gave both Carl and Case a stern warning that their shenanigans had caused quite a stir. But Case said that though the officer spoke with an angry tongue, he detected a sympathetic twinkle in the man's eye. Later, Arlene heard him say that if he were ever in the same circumstances as Bill, he hoped that his friends would care enough to kidnap him for an afternoon. It was only 4 days later that Bill had a second stroke, and that was the one that took him. I heard from Arlene that Nellie spoke of reviving the charges against the boys, now to include murder, but the nursing supervisor talked her out of it. No trouble for them. It was, after all, her father's last request. So in the end, Case and Carl got lucky. The doctor said that the clot that took Bill could have been ready to go already on the afternoon of the breakout as they were bouncing him across the clear cut. It would have been a much different situation if Bill had had his last stroke when the boys were all on the mountainside together. It was really a stupid idea. It was crazy, it was risky, it was dangerous, and it was perhaps the most loving thing Case and Carl could have done for Bill in what turned out to be his last days. Love is always like that. It's risky, dangerous, and messy too. Think of all the crazy things we do when we are in love, in a romantic relationship. We smile and applaud when a young man hires an airplane to pull a marriage proposal across the sky. But I think we ought to applaud when he changes her bedpan 50 years later. Love always requires us to put ourselves out there where we can get in trouble or get hurt. Why? Because love is by nature risky and dangerous. And love is at the heart of God, who gave himself completely for us. I think about that now as I consider my own life. If love is really known in the things we do, more than the feelings we have or even the things we say, then am I a loving person? As loving as Jesus was? How many times have I left a casserole and a loaf of bread on the front porch of a member of the church when they were sick, when what they probably really wanted was someone to talk to? But of course, to stop and listen is to give of yourself, not just your time or your frozen hamburger dish. And you might be drawn into their life, their worries, and their needs. Risky and dangerous indeed. Thankfully, God takes all our love offerings, meager as they are, and blesses them with his grace. Perhaps, as in the case of Bill Lundgren, he even multiplies them. Now that Bill is gone, I am proud of Case for doing all he did. I hope one day I will have the courage to commit acts of love using guerrilla tactics. I hope you will too. Love is risky, but it's always a risk worth taking. Just ask Jesus. But now the cattle are looking for a little loving from me. Case is off doing some trout fishing with our grandson Kevin, and they don't expect to be home until late, so it falls to me to feed the hungry. We look forward to hearing from you amidst all the busyness of your life these days. Though you have moved from us, know always that we have plenty of room for each of you, in our home and in our hearts. We'd love to have you come and visit one day soon, here on the banks of the Sayou River, where the black bears walk and the salmon run. Much love and blessings to all of you. Ultra and Case DeWitt.